The morning sun cast long shadows across the manicured gardens of Clarence House as Camilla, Queen Consort of England, stood before her ornate mirror adjusting the pearl necklace that had become her signature piece. Her reflection showed a woman who had weathered many storms, but today something felt different. There was an unusual tension in the air, a heaviness that seemed to press against her chest as she prepared for what should have been a routine royal engagement. Charles had left early for his morning constitutional, a habit he maintained religiously despite the increasing demands of the crown. Their relationship, once the subject of intense scrutiny and public disapproval, had settled into a comfortable rhythm of mutual respect and shared duty. Yet lately, Camilla had noticed a distance growing between them, subtle but unmistakable, like a crack in fine china that threatens to spread. The telephone rang sharply, interrupting her thoughts. It was her private secretary, informing her that several members of her family had arrived unexpectedly at the palace gates. Her heart sank immediately. She had specifically requested that they coordinate any visits through proper channels, understanding all too well the delicate balance required in royal protocol. Her family's tendency toward spontaneity had always been both endearing and problematic, but never more so than since she had assumed her current role. As she made her way through the corridors toward the main reception area, Camilla's mind raced with possible explanations for their unannounced arrival. Perhaps it was her brother Mark, always the impulsive one, or possibly her children from her first marriage who sometimes struggled with the rigid formality that now governed her life. The sound of her heels clicking against the marble floors echoed through the empty halls, a rhythmic reminder of the solitary nature of her position. Upon reaching the grand foyer, she was met by Sir Clive Alderton, Charles's private secretary, whose usually composed demeanor showed signs of strain. His face bore the careful neutrality that palace staff had perfected over decades of service, but Camilla could read the underlying tension in his posture. He approached her with measured steps, his hands clasped behind his back in the formal manner that indicated serious business. The conversation that followed would prove to be one of the most challenging moments of Camilla's royal tenure. Sir Clive informed her that King Charles had issued explicit instructions regarding her family's visit. They were not to be granted entry to any royal residence, nor were they to be received in any official capacity. The words hit her like physical blows, each one carrying the weight of personal rejection and public humiliation. Her immediate reaction was disbelief. Surely there had been some misunderstanding, some confusion in the complex web of royal protocol that could be easily resolved. She had always prided herself on her ability to navigate the intricate social dynamics of royal life, to bridge the gap between her previous existence and her current reality. But this felt different, more personal, more deliberately hurtful than any previous slight she had endured. The reasons behind Charles's decision remained unclear, wrapped in the diplomatic language that palace officials used to obscure uncomfortable truths. There were mentions of security concerns and protocol violations, but Camilla knew these were likely pretexts for deeper issues. Her family's working-class background and their sometimes unguarded comments to the press had always been sources of tension within the royal establishment, but she had believed that her marriage to Charles had provided them with a certain level of protection. As she stood in the ornate reception hall, surrounded by portraits of previous monarchs who gazed down with silent judgment, Camilla felt the full weight of her isolation. The very walls seemed to whisper of duty and sacrifice, of personal desires sublimated to the greater good of the institution. She had willingly entered this world, understanding the costs, but the reality of those costs felt more acute in this moment than ever before. Her thoughts turned to her children, Tom and Laura, who had grown up in the shadow of their mother's controversial relationship with the then Prince of Wales. They had endured years of media scrutiny, of being photographed and analyzed, of having their every move interpreted as either supporting or undermining their mother's position. Now, it seemed, they were being punished again for circumstances largely beyond their control. The irony was not lost on her that she stood in a building funded by the very people who were now being turned away at its gates. The British public, whose taxes maintained these grand residences, included families like hers, ordinary people who had never asked for the spotlight, but found themselves thrust into it by association. Yet the rigid hierarchy of the monarchy seemed to demand a separation between the royal family and the common relations who might somehow tarnish their carefully cultivated image. Camilla's mind drifted to the early days of her relationship with Charles, when everything had seemed simpler despite the enormous obstacles they faced. They had bonded over shared interests and a similar sense of humor, finding in each other a refuge from the expectations and pressures of their respective positions. Charles had been drawn to her authenticity, her ability to remain grounded despite the extraordinary circumstances of their courtship. Now, that very authenticity seemed to be viewed as a liability. The palace staff moved around her with practiced efficiency, their expressions carefully neutral as they went about their daily tasks. She wondered what they truly thought about the situation, whether they saw her as an interloper who had somehow conned her way into their rarefied world, or whether they recognized her genuine attempts to honor the traditions and responsibilities of her role. The silence of their judgment was perhaps more unsettling than open criticism would have been. As the morning progressed, Camilla found herself questioning everything she thought she understood about her place in the royal family. Had Charles's feelings toward her changed, or was this simply another example of the institutional pressures that constantly shaped royal decision-making? The man she had married seemed to exist in constant tension with the king he had become, and she was never entirely sure which version of him she would encounter on any given day. The psychological toll of constantly performing for public consumption had worn on both of them over the years. Every public appearance was scrutinized, every gesture analyzed for hidden meanings, every interaction with family members viewed through the lens of potential scandal or embarrassment. The natural spontaneity that had once characterized their relationship had given way to carefully choreographed interactions designed to project stability and appropriate royal behavior. Her family's exclusion felt like a rejection of everything she had been before becoming queen consort. It was as if Charles was demanding that she shed her past entirely, to emerge fully formed as a royal personage with no inconvenient connections to her previous life. The message seemed clear. Her value lay not in who she was as a complete person, but in her ability to fulfill a specific role within the monarchy's carefully constructed narrative. The afternoon brought a series of scheduled appointments that Camilla was expected to fulfill despite the morning's traumatic events. Royal duty demanded that personal crises be subordinated to public responsibilities, that the show must go on regardless of private anguish. She found herself mechanically going through the motions of her official engagements, smiling at appropriate moments, making small talk with dignitaries, cutting ribbons, and unveiling plaques as if her world had not been fundamentally shaken just hours before. The public nature of her role meant that there was no private space for grief or anger, no opportunity to process the emotional impact of what felt like a profound betrayal. Every moment was potentially being photographed or recorded, every expression analyzed for signs of strain or discontent. The performance of royal serenity had to be maintained even as her internal world crumbled. During a brief break between engagements, Camilla retreated to a private sitting room and allowed herself a moment of vulnerability. The tears came suddenly and forcefully, carrying with them years of accumulated stress and sacrifice. She wept for the family relationships that had been strained by her royal role, for the spontaneous moments of joy that had been replaced by rigid protocol, and for the growing sense that she was losing herself in the demands of her position. The sound of approaching footsteps forced her to quickly compose herself, dabbing at her eyes with a handkerchief and checking her reflection in a nearby mirror. The mask of royal composure slipped back into place as easily as breathing, a skill she had developed through years of practice. But underneath the carefully maintained exterior, something fundamental had shifted. A line had been crossed that could not be uncrossed, a boundary established that would forever alter the dynamics of her most important relationships. As evening approached, Camilla prepared to return to Clarence House, and the inevitable confrontation with Charles. The weight of unspoken words hung heavy in the air between them, and she knew that their conversation would determine not just the immediate resolution of the day's crisis, but the entire future trajectory of their marriage and her role within the royal family. The stakes could not be higher, and the outcome remained terrifyingly uncertain. The drive back through the London streets provided a temporary respite from the intensity of the day's emotions. Through the tinted windows of her official car, she watched ordinary people going about their daily lives, unaware of the drama playing out within the royal household. Their normalcy seemed both enviable and impossibly distant, a reminder of the life she had left behind and could never fully reclaim. The approaching conversation with Charles loomed large in her thoughts, carrying with it the potential to either heal the rift that had opened between them or to widen it beyond repair. She understood that more than just her family's access to royal residences was at stake. The very foundation of trust and partnership that their marriage was built upon hung in the balance. The decisions made in the next few hours would echo through the remainder of their reign and potentially reshape the monarchy itself. As her car passed through the gates of Clarence House, Camilla steeled herself for what was to come. The woman who had once been dismissed as unsuitable for royal life was about to fight for her family, her dignity, and her place in the institution that had both elevated and constrained her. The battle lines were drawn, and the outcome would determine whether love and loyalty could triumph over protocol and prejudice in the rarefied world of the British monarchy. The familiar comfort of Clarence House felt strangely foreign as Camilla entered the main drawing room where Charles was waiting. He stood with his back to her, silhouetted against the tall windows that overlooked the garden they had once planned together with such enthusiasm. The silence between them stretched uncomfortably, filled with the weight of unspoken accusations and long-suppressed resentments. When he finally turned to face her, his expression was carefully controlled, revealing nothing of the man she had fallen in love with decades earlier. Charles's appearance had changed subtly since assuming the throne. The crown's responsibilities had etched new lines around his eyes and added a gravitas to his bearing that sometimes made him seem like a stranger. Today, those changes felt more pronounced than ever, as if the institution itself had finally succeeded in erasing the last traces of the passionate, sometimes impetuous man she had married. His formal posture and measured movements spoke of duty and obligation rather than the warmth and intimacy that had once characterized their private moments. The conversation began with pleasantries, a careful dance around the explosive issue that had brought them together. Charles inquired about her day's engagements with the same polite interest he might show a visiting dignitary, while Camilla responded with equal formality despite the turmoil roiling beneath her composed exterior. They were like actors playing roles they had performed countless times before, but tonight the script felt different, charged with an undercurrent of tension that threatened to break through their carefully maintained facade. When Charles finally addressed the morning's events, his tone was clinical, almost detached. He spoke of security protocols and institutional requirements as if her family were merely another administrative challenge to be managed rather than real people whose feelings and dignity mattered. His words carried the authority of the crown, but they felt cold and impersonal, lacking any acknowledgement of the emotional impact his decisions had on the woman who shared his life and his burden. Camilla listened in growing disbelief as Charles outlined the reasoning behind his exclusion of her family. There were concerns about their ability to maintain appropriate discretion, questions about their understanding of royal protocol, and worries about potential media complications that might arise from their presence at official events. Each justification felt like a small betrayal, a suggestion that her judgment in matters involving her own family could not be trusted. The institutional language he employed served to distance him from the personal nature of his decision, as if he were merely implementing policies established by others rather than making choices that would profoundly affect his wife's relationships with her loved ones. This deflection of responsibility onto abstract concepts of royal duty and tradition was perhaps the most hurtful aspect of his presentation, suggesting that their marriage itself was subordinate to the demands of the monarchy. As Camilla began to respond, her carefully maintained composure started to crack. The emotions she had suppressed throughout the day began to surface, and her voice carried a tremor that she could not entirely control. She spoke of loyalty and family bonds, of the sacrifices she had already made for the institution, and of the fundamental unfairness of punishing innocent people for circumstances beyond their control. Her words were measured but passionate, carrying the weight of years of accumulated frustration and disappointment. The discussion revealed fundamental differences in how they viewed the nature of their roles and responsibilities. Charles seemed to see himself as a steward of an ancient institution whose preservation required difficult personal sacrifices, while Camilla argued for a more human approach that balanced institutional needs with basic compassion and family loyalty. Their debate touched on issues that went to the heart of what it meant to be royal in the modern world. Charles's response to her emotional appeal was to cite historical precedents and constitutional requirements, as if their personal relationship were merely another aspect of royal business to be managed according to established procedures. He spoke of Queen Victoria's isolation from her relatives, of Edward VII's careful management of potentially embarrassing family connections, and of the current Queen's own difficult decisions regarding family members who had caused constitutional complications. The historical parallels he drew felt like a deliberate attempt to minimize her concerns by placing them within a broader context of royal sacrifice and duty. But, for Camilla, these were not abstract historical examples. They were real people whose lives were being disrupted by decisions made in palace boardrooms without their input or consideration. The human cost of royal protocol was something she experienced daily, not merely an interesting historical footnote. As their conversation continued, it became clear that this was not simply a disagreement about family access or security protocols. It was a fundamental conflict about the nature of their partnership and the extent to which personal relationships could survive within the rigid structures of monarchy. Charles seemed to believe that their marriage existed to serve the institution, while Camilla had hoped that the institution could be flexible enough to accommodate the realities of human relationships. The emotional temperature in the room continued to rise as both parties became more entrenched in their positions. Charles's increasingly formal tone suggested that he viewed her resistance to his decision as a form of insubordination rather than a legitimate expression of personal pain and frustration. This characterization of their disagreement as a matter of royal hierarchy rather than marital partnership was perhaps the most devastating aspect of their exchange. Camilla found herself arguing not just for her family's rights, but for her own identity and autonomy within their relationship. The exclusion of her relatives felt like a symbolic rejection of everything she had been before becoming queen consort, a demand that she completely reinvent herself according to someone else's vision of appropriate royal behavior. The personal had become political in the most painful way imaginable. The conversation took on an increasingly desperate quality as Camilla tried to make Charles understand the emotional impact of his decision. She spoke of her children's confusion and hurt, of her siblings' sense of rejection and abandonment, and of her own growing isolation within the royal bubble. These personal costs seemed to register with Charles only as additional complications to be managed rather than genuine sources of pain that required his attention and care. His responses became more bureaucratic and less personal as the discussion progressed, as if he were reading from a briefing paper rather than speaking to his wife about matters that affected their family. This emotional distancing was particularly painful for Camilla, who had always valued their ability to speak honestly with each other about difficult subjects. The man she was arguing with seemed like a stranger wearing her husband's face. The breakdown in communication between them reflected larger tensions within the royal family about how to balance tradition with modernity, duty with personal happiness, and institutional needs with human relationships. These were not new challenges, but they felt particularly acute in the context of a marriage that had already weathered so much public scrutiny and institutional resistance. As the evening wore on, their argument began to touch on deeper issues of trust and respect within their relationship. Camilla questioned whether Charles truly valued her counsel and partnership, or whether he saw her primarily as an accessory to his royal role whose personal needs and opinions were secondary to institutional requirements. These questions struck at the foundation of their marriage and raised uncomfortable truths about the power dynamics that shaped their daily lives. Charles's growing irritation with her persistence suggested that he expected her to accept his decisions without question or debate, much as his staff might be expected to implement his directives without expressing personal opinions. This expectation of unquestioning compliance felt like a betrayal of the equality and mutual respect that had supposedly characterized their relationship from its beginning. The institutional pressures that had shaped Charles's decision-making process began to emerge more clearly as their conversation continued. He spoke of advisors who had raised concerns about security risks and protocol violations, of press officers who worried about negative publicity, and of constitutional experts who questioned the appropriateness of certain family associations. The web of institutional voices that surrounded him seemed to have drowned out any consideration of his wife's personal feelings or family relationships. Camilla began to realize that she was not just arguing with her husband, but with an entire system of advisors, traditions, and expectations that had shaped his thinking about appropriate royal behavior. This recognition made her task seem even more daunting, as she was essentially asking him to choose her perspective over the collective wisdom of the institutional structure that had governed royal behavior for generations. The emotional exhaustion of their extended argument began to show in both their voices and postures. What had begun as a discussion between equals had devolved into something more resembling a negotiation between adversaries, with each party defending positions that seemed increasingly incompatible. The love and partnership that had sustained them through previous crises felt fragile and uncertain in the face of such fundamental disagreement. As their conversation entered its third hour, both Charles and Camilla seemed to recognize that they had reached an impasse that could not be resolved through continued debate. The issues they were grappling with touched on fundamental questions of identity, loyalty, and power that went beyond the immediate question of family access to royal residences. Their marriage itself seemed to hang in the balance as they struggled to find common ground on issues that neither was willing to compromise. The realization that their relationship might not survive this crisis began to dawn on both of them as the evening progressed. The stakes of their disagreement had escalated far beyond the original issue to encompass questions about the very nature of their partnership and their shared future. The weight of this recognition settled over them like a shroud, making every word feel potentially decisive in determining the ultimate outcome of their conflict. The silence that followed their heated exchange was deafening, punctuated only by the steady tick of the antique grandfather clock in the corner of the room. Camilla stood by the window, her reflection ghost-like in the darkened glass, while Charles remained seated in his leather armchair, his fingers steepled as he contemplated the gravity of their situation. The emotional chasm that had opened between them felt vast and unbridgeable, filled with years of unspoken resentments and incompatible expectations about the nature of their partnership. When Camilla finally spoke again, her voice was barely above a whisper, but her words carried the weight of absolute conviction. She told Charles that she had reached her breaking point, that the constant erosion of her personal relationships and family connections in service of royal protocol had pushed her to the edge of what she could endure. The institution that had once seemed like a shared adventure had become a prison that was slowly suffocating everything she held dear about her identity and her past. Charles listened without interruption as she outlined the accumulated costs of their royal life. She spoke of missed family gatherings because of scheduling conflicts with royal duties, of relationships that had withered under the pressure of constant media scrutiny, and of the growing sense that she was losing touch with the person she had been before becoming queen consort. Each example felt like another weight added to an already unbearable burden. The transformation that royal life had demanded of her went far beyond changes in wardrobe or public speaking skills. It had required a fundamental reconstruction of her personality, her priorities, and her understanding of what constituted appropriate behavior in virtually every aspect of her existence. The spontaneous, warm-hearted woman who had captured Charles's heart had been gradually replaced by a more cautious, calculating figure who carefully weighed every word and gesture for its potential impact on royal reputation. Her children had borne much of the cost of her royal transformation. Tom and Laura had been thrust into the public eye as teenagers, their every move scrutinized for signs of inappropriate behavior or poor judgment. They had endured years of photographers camping outside their homes, of classmates treating them as curiosities rather than friends, and of constant pressure to live up to impossible standards of conduct. Now, as adults, they were being excluded from their mother's life based on judgments about their suitability for royal association. The irony of Charles's position was not lost on Camilla as she continued her passionate defense of her family. The man who had famously rebelled against royal expectations throughout his own youth, who had spoken publicly about the isolation and artificiality of royal life, was now demanding that she sever connections with anyone who might not meet the institution's exacting standards. His transformation from royal rebel to institutional enforcer felt like a betrayal of everything they had once shared. Charles's response, when it finally came, revealed the depth of the pressure he was under from various quarters within the royal establishment. He spoke of newspaper editors who were looking for any excuse to resurrect old scandals, of political figures who questioned the monarchy's relevance in modern Britain, and of constitutional experts who warned about the dangers of any appearance of impropriety. The burden of maintaining the institution's credibility seemed to weigh on him like a physical force. The discussion began to reveal the complex web of relationships and expectations that shaped every royal decision. Charles described meetings with senior palace officials who had expressed concerns about Camilla's family's potential for generating negative publicity. There were references to social media posts by distant relatives, to casual comments made to tabloid journalists, and to associations with people whose backgrounds might not withstand intense scrutiny. Each potential problem seemed to multiply into dozens of additional complications that required careful management. Camilla began to understand that the decision to exclude her family was not entirely Charles's own, but rather the product of a collective institutional assessment that prioritized risk management over personal relationships. This realization was both relieving and terrifying. Relieving because it suggested that Charles had not personally rejected her family, but terrifying because it revealed the extent to which their personal lives were subject to institutional control and manipulation. The conversation took on a new dimension as they began to explore the broader implications of the royal system's impact on their marriage. Camilla questioned whether any genuine relationship could survive the constant interference and judgment of palace officials, press officers, and constitutional advisors. The very concept of privacy seemed to be incompatible with royal life, as every personal decision became a matter of public interest and institutional concern. Charles struggled to defend a system that he himself had often criticized, but which he now felt responsible for maintaining. His transformation from heir to king had required him to become a guardian of traditions and protocols that had once chafed against his own sensibilities. The weight of constitutional responsibility seemed to have overwhelmed his personal instincts and desires, leaving him to defend positions that might have appalled his younger self. Their argument began to touch on fundamental questions about the nature of sacrifice and duty in royal life. Charles seemed to believe that total submission to institutional requirements was not only necessary, but noble, while Camilla argued that such complete subordination of personal relationships ultimately undermined the humanity that made the monarchy relevant to ordinary people. Their different perspectives on this issue reflected deeper philosophical differences about the purpose and value of the royal institution itself. As the night progressed, Camilla found herself questioning not just Charles's specific decision about her family, but the entire structure of their life together. She began to wonder whether the person she had married still existed underneath the layers of royal protocol and institutional pressure, or whether that man had been gradually erased by the demands of his role. The possibility that she had lost her husband to the crown was almost too painful to contemplate. The emotional toll of their extended confrontation was evident in both their faces and voices. What had begun as a specific disagreement about family access had evolved into a comprehensive examination of their relationship, their individual identities, and their shared future. The stakes of their conversation had escalated far beyond what either had anticipated when the evening began. Charles made several attempts to find middle ground, proposing various compromises that might allow limited family contact while maintaining what he saw as necessary security and protocol standards. But each proposal felt to Camilla like a half measure that failed to address the fundamental issue of respect for her judgment and autonomy. The very fact that he was offering to negotiate access to her own family felt like an insult to her dignity and intelligence. The power dynamics of their relationship had become increasingly apparent as their discussion continued. Despite the supposed equality of their marriage, it was clear that Charles's position as king gave him ultimate authority over decisions that affected both their lives. This reality had always existed but had been obscured by their personal affection and shared goals. Now it stood exposed as a fundamental obstacle to genuine partnership. Camilla's growing anger was directed not just at Charles personally, but at the entire system that had conspired to place them in this impossible situation. She railed against advisors who seemed to view her as a liability rather than an asset, against protocols that prioritized appearance over substance, and against a media establishment that profited from royal family discord. Her fury was all the more powerful for having been suppressed for so long. The conversation reached a new level of intensity when Camilla directly challenged Charles's authority to make unilateral decisions about her family relationships. She argued that marriage, even royal marriage, required mutual consent on matters affecting both partners, and that his decision to exclude her family violated the basic principles of partnership and respect that any successful relationship required. This direct challenge to his authority seemed to shock Charles into silence. The institutional pressures that had shaped Charles's thinking became more explicit as he struggled to defend his position. He spoke of legal advice about potential security risks, of intelligence briefings about media monitoring, and of constitutional precedents that govern royal family associations. The complex machinery of modern monarchy had apparently generated an overwhelming array of concerns that made normal family relationships seem impossibly complicated and dangerous. Camilla began to realize that they were not just arguing about her family, but about the fundamental question of whether authentic human relationships could exist within the constraints of royal life. The system seemed designed to eliminate spontaneity, genuine emotion, and personal loyalty in favor of carefully managed public performances and strategic decision-making. The cost of this artificial existence was becoming unbearable. As their confrontation entered its fourth hour, both Charles and Camilla seemed exhausted by the emotional intensity of their exchange. The issues they were grappling with had no easy solutions, touching as they did on fundamental conflicts between personal happiness and institutional duty, between individual autonomy and collective responsibility, between authentic relationships and strategic public presentation. Their marriage had become a battleground for these larger cultural and constitutional questions. The realization that their relationship might not survive this crisis was becoming increasingly apparent to both of them. The fundamental differences in their approaches to royal life and personal relationships seemed irreconcilable, threatening to destroy the love and partnership that had sustained them through decades of public scrutiny and personal challenges. The weight of this possibility hung over them like a sword as they struggled to find a path forward. The breaking point came suddenly and without warning. After hours of circular arguments and increasingly desperate attempts at compromise, Camilla's emotional defenses finally collapsed completely. The tears that she had been holding back since the morning erupted in a flood of anguish that seemed to surprise even her with its intensity. Years of suppressed frustration, accumulated disappointments, and mounting pressure found their release in sobs that shook her entire body and left her gasping for breath. Charles was visibly shaken by the raw emotion of her breakdown. The composed, dignified woman he had grown accustomed to seeing in public and private had been replaced by someone who seemed utterly broken by the weight of her circumstances. Her tears were not the controlled, photogenic expressions of emotion that royal training had taught her to display on appropriate occasions, but the ugly, desperate crying of someone who had reached the absolute limit of their endurance. Through her sobs, Camilla began to articulate the depth of her pain in ways that her earlier rational arguments had failed to convey. She spoke of feeling like a prisoner in her own life, of losing touch with everyone and everything that had once given her joy and meaning. The royal role that had initially seemed like an adventure had become a straitjacket that constrained every aspect of her existence, from her choice of friends to her ability to express genuine emotions in public settings. Her breakdown revealed the psychological toll that years of royal life had exacted on her mental health and sense of self. The constant performance required of royal figures had gradually eroded her ability to distinguish between her public persona and her authentic self. She described feeling like an actor who had become so identified with a role that she had forgotten her own identity, trapped in a character that felt increasingly foreign and uncomfortable. The isolation that came with royal status had been more profound and damaging than she had anticipated when she first entered Charles's world. Despite being constantly surrounded by staff, security personnel, and official companions, she often felt desperately alone, cut off from the spontaneous human connections that had once nourished her spirit. The friendships and family relationships that had sustained her through previous difficulties had been gradually sacrificed to the demands of royal protocol and media management. Charles watched helplessly as his wife's composure disintegrated before his eyes. The institutional training that had equipped him to handle public crises and constitutional challenges had not prepared him for the sight of his partner's complete emotional collapse. His own emotional responses had been so thoroughly conditioned by royal expectations that he struggled to respond naturally to her obvious distress and pain. The conversation that followed Camilla's breakdown was markedly different in tone and content from their earlier exchanges. Charles's formal, institutional language gave way to more personal and vulnerable expressions of his own struggles with the demands of kingship. He admitted to feeling trapped by expectations and responsibilities that sometimes felt overwhelming, and to missing aspects of his previous life that had been sacrificed to royal duty. For the first time in their extended confrontation, Charles acknowledged the personal cost of his decision regarding Camilla's family. He spoke of his own internal conflict between his love for her and his sense of obligation to the institution they both served. The weight of the crown had apparently made him hyper-vigilant about potential threats to royal reputation, leading him to make decisions that prioritized institutional interests over personal relationships. Camilla's emotional vulnerability seemed to break through the defensive barriers that Charles had constructed around his feelings about their situation. He began to express his own doubts about the wisdom of completely isolating themselves from normal family relationships, and to question whether the security and protocol concerns that had driven his decision were really as serious as his advisors had suggested. The revelation that Charles himself harbored doubts about his decision provided the first glimmer of hope that their crisis might be resolvable. His admission that he had perhaps been too influenced by the fears and prejudices of palace officials suggested that there might be room for reconsideration and compromise. However, the damage done by his initial decision and the manner in which it had been communicated could not be easily undone. Their conversation began to explore the broader question of how they might restructure their relationship to better balance institutional demands with personal needs. Camilla argued passionately for the importance of maintaining some connections to their pre-royal lives as a source of authenticity and emotional grounding. She contended that complete isolation from normal human relationships ultimately made them less effective as royal figures, not more so. Charles struggled with the competing demands of his role as king and his responsibilities as a husband. The constitutional monarchy required him to be above politics and controversy, but his personal relationships inevitably generated both. The challenge was finding ways to honor his obligations to both the institution and his family without completely sacrificing one for the other. The discussion revealed the extent to which their marital problems were symptoms of larger issues within the modern monarchy itself. The institution struggled to remain relevant in a democratic age while maintaining its traditional mystique created impossible contradictions that affected every aspect of royal life. Personal authenticity and institutional requirements seemed fundamentally incompatible, creating constant stress and conflict for everyone involved. As dawn approached, both Charles and Camilla seemed exhausted by the emotional intensity of their all-night confrontation. The issues they had grappled with had no easy solutions, requiring fundamental changes in how they approached their royal roles and personal relationships. The path forward would require courage, compromise, and a willingness to challenge established traditions and expectations. Camilla's breakdown had served as a catalyst for honest communication about problems that had been festering beneath the surface of their marriage for years. The crisis over her family's exclusion had exposed deeper issues of autonomy, respect, and identity that needed to be addressed if their relationship was to survive the pressures of royal life. The conversation had been painful but necessary, clearing the air of years of accumulated resentment and misunderstanding. The immediate question of her family's status remained unresolved, but the framework for addressing it had shifted significantly. Charles's acknowledgement of his wife's pain and his own doubts about his decision had opened the possibility for a different approach that might honor both institutional requirements and personal relationships. The challenge would be finding specific solutions that satisfied the legitimate concerns of all parties involved. Their marriage had been tested to its limits by the events of the past day, but it had not been broken. The love and partnership that had sustained them through previous crises remained, albeit strained and battered by the intensity of their conflict. The work of rebuilding trust and finding sustainable compromises would be difficult and ongoing, requiring constant vigilance against the institutional pressures that had created their current crisis. The broader implications of their personal struggle extended far beyond their individual marriage to questions about the future of the monarchy itself. The challenge of maintaining institutional authority while remaining emotionally authentic to the public was becoming increasingly difficult in an age of social media and instant communication. Their ability to resolve their personal conflicts might serve as a model for how the monarchy could adapt to changing social expectations. As the sun rose over London, casting new light through the windows of Clarence House, both Charles and Camilla seemed to recognize that they had reached a turning point in their relationship and their royal careers. The decisions they made in the coming days would determine not only the immediate fate of her family's access to royal functions, but the entire future trajectory of their marriage and their effectiveness as royal representatives. The night of confrontation had been devastating but perhaps necessary, stripping away the polite pretenses and careful protocols that had prevented them from addressing fundamental problems in their relationship. The raw honesty that had emerged from Camilla's emotional breakdown had created an opportunity for genuine change, if they had the courage and wisdom to seize it. The work of reconstruction would be painstaking and uncertain, but for the first time in months, both seemed cautiously optimistic that their marriage and their royal roles might be compatible after all. The morning light streaming through the windows of Clarence House revealed two people fundamentally changed by their night of brutal honesty and emotional revelation. Charles and Camilla sat in exhausted silence, the weight of their conversation hanging between them like a bridge they were both afraid to cross. The formal distance that had characterized their interaction for months had been replaced by a raw vulnerability that neither was quite sure how to navigate in the clear light of day. Charles was the first to speak, his voice hoarse from hours of intense discussion, but somehow warmer than it had been in recent memory. He acknowledged that his handling of the situation with her family had been deeply flawed, driven more by institutional paranoia than genuine security concerns. The pressure from palace advisors to maintain absolute control over royal associations had led him to make decisions that violated the trust and partnership that formed the foundation of their marriage. The conversation that followed was markedly different from their confrontational exchange of the previous night. Both seemed to recognize that they stood at a crossroads that would determine not only the immediate resolution of their crisis, but the entire future of their relationship. The stakes were too high for pride or stubbornness to dictate their choices, requiring instead a level of maturity and compromise that would test everything they claimed to believe about love and partnership. Camilla listened with cautious hope as Charles outlined a series of concrete steps he was prepared to take to address her concerns. He spoke of restructuring his advisory process to include her input on decisions affecting her family, of establishing clear protocols for family visits that balance security needs with personal relationships, and of taking a more active role in protecting her relatives from unnecessary media scrutiny and institutional harassment. The specific proposals were encouraging, but Camilla remained wary of promises that might be undermined by the same institutional pressures that had created their current crisis. She had heard similar commitments before, only to watch them erode under the relentless demands of royal protocol and the endless stream of crises that seemed to dominate their daily lives. Trust, once broken, would require consistent action over time to rebuild. Their discussion revealed the complex web of relationships and dependencies that would need to be renegotiated if meaningful change were to occur. Charles's advisors had their own agendas and priorities that did not necessarily align with the royal couple's personal happiness or family relationships. Changing the dynamic would require not just different decisions, but different decision-makers, a prospect that carried its own risks and complications. The process of rebuilding their relationship began with small but significant gestures of mutual respect and consideration. Charles agreed to personally call Camilla's children to apologize for the confusion and hurt caused by the previous day's events. More importantly, he committed to including her in future discussions about family-related policies before decisions were made rather than presenting her with predetermined conclusions. Camilla, for her part, acknowledged that her frustration with institutional constraints had sometimes led her to be less supportive of Charles's broader responsibilities as king. The pressure he faced to maintain the monarchy's credibility and relevance in modern Britain was real and demanding, requiring difficult choices that often had no perfect solutions. Her role as his partner required understanding and supporting these challenges even when they conflicted with her personal preferences. The conversation gradually expanded beyond their immediate crisis to encompass broader questions about how they might restructure their approach to royal duties to better accommodate their personal needs and family relationships. They discussed the possibility of developing new protocols that would allow for more spontaneous family interactions while still maintaining appropriate security and media management standards. Charles revealed that he had been considering various reforms to royal procedures that might make their lives more personally sustainable, but had hesitated to implement them due to resistance from traditional elements within the palace establishment. Camilla's emotional breakdown had apparently provided the catalyst he needed to push forward with changes he had been contemplating for months, but had lacked the courage to pursue. The institutional resistance to change that they both faced was formidable, rooted in centuries of tradition and reinforced by advisors whose careers depended on maintaining established procedures. Challenging these entrenched interests would require sustained effort and strategic thinking, as well as a willingness to accept that some conflicts were inevitable. The royal establishment had survived for generations by resisting change and would not easily adapt to new approaches. As their discussion continued throughout the morning, both Charles and Camilla seemed to rediscover aspects of each other that had been obscured by months of formal interaction and careful protocol management. The spontaneous humor and intellectual curiosity that had originally drawn them together began to resurface, reminding them of what they had found attractive in their partnership before it became complicated by institutional demands. The process of reconciliation was neither quick nor easy, requiring them to work through years of accumulated grievances and misunderstandings that extended far beyond the immediate issue of family access. Each problem they identified seemed to reveal additional layers of complexity that would need to be addressed if they were to build a more sustainable approach to their royal roles and personal relationship. By midday, they had developed a preliminary framework for addressing the most immediate concerns while beginning the longer-term work of restructuring their relationship and their approach to royal duties. Charles agreed to reverse his decision about Camilla's family and to work with security officials to develop protocols that would allow for regular family interactions without compromising legitimate safety concerns. The announcement of this reversal would require careful management to avoid appearing weak or indecisive, but both agreed that the credibility costs were worth paying to preserve their marriage and family relationships. The monarchy's long-term health depended on the personal authenticity and happiness of its representatives, making their reconciliation not just personally important, but institutionally necessary. The media strategy for explaining the change in policy required delicate balancing between acknowledging mistakes and maintaining royal dignity. Charles's team would need to craft messaging that presented the reversal as a thoughtful response to new information rather than a capitulation to family pressure. The challenge would be managing the inevitable speculation about discord within the royal household without providing additional ammunition for critics. Camilla's relief at the resolution of the immediate crisis was tempered by awareness that the underlying structural problems in their relationship and their royal roles would require ongoing attention and care. The emotional breakthrough they had experienced provided a foundation for change, but transforming institutional cultures and personal habits would be a gradual process requiring constant vigilance and commitment. The afternoon brought the first test of their renewed partnership as they worked together to craft communications to Camilla's family explaining the reversal of Charles's decision. The tone and content of these messages would signal whether their reconciliation was genuine or merely a temporary truce designed to manage the immediate crisis. The warmth and specificity of Charles's personal apologies suggested that his change of heart was authentic. As evening approached, both Charles and Camilla seemed cautiously optimistic about their ability to navigate the challenges that lay ahead. Their marriage had been severely tested by the events of the past 2 days, but it had ultimately proven resilient enough to withstand the pressure. The work of rebuilding trust and developing more sustainable approaches to their royal duties would continue for months and years to come, but they had established a framework for addressing future conflicts before they reached crisis proportions. The broader implications of their personal reconciliation extended far beyond their individual relationship to questions about the monarchy's ability to adapt to changing social expectations and personal needs. Their experience demonstrated both the enormous pressures that royal life placed on personal relationships and the possibility of finding ways to honor both institutional requirements and human emotions. The story of their crisis and reconciliation would inevitably become part of the public narrative about the modern monarchy, providing either an example of successful adaptation or a cautionary tale about the costs of royal service. Their ability to maintain both their marriage and their royal effectiveness would be closely watched by supporters and critics alike, adding another layer of pressure to their already complex situation. As they prepared for bed after their exhausting ordeal, both Charles and Camilla seemed to recognize that they had crossed a threshold in their relationship and their understanding of their royal roles. The easy assumptions about duty and sacrifice that had once guided their decisions had been replaced by a more nuanced appreciation of the need to balance institutional demands with personal authenticity and family loyalty. The future remained uncertain, filled with challenges that would test their renewed commitment to partnership and mutual respect. But for the first time in months, they faced those challenges together, united by a shared understanding of what they had almost lost and a determination to build something stronger and more sustainable from the wreckage of their crisis. Their love had proven more resilient than the institutional pressures that had threatened to destroy it, providing hope that the monarchy itself might find ways to honor both its traditions and its humanity.